So initially this was going to be a story on LTPS last Friday, but I thought, you know what, there's a lot here to unpack and talk about, so we can probably make this a separate conversation. So the news, well, initially from about 2 weeks ago, came from Sony's financial report about how they confirmed that they have 118 million monthly active users on PSN, which is true. We talked about that when the financial report came out, but the more recent development here is actually more of a conversation starter on that number itself, because this sprang up from Stephen Totillo of GameFile, where over on his personal Twitter account he mentioned, well, he more or less reaffirmed this news, saying that Sony says PS5 is in the second half of its life cycle, which it is. He mentions the 118 million monthly active users and that half are still on PS4, and he says, get that? Half of PS players aren't on current gen, which he does also provide a quote directly from Sony, which this is what they said at the time, that cumulative PS5 sales is 59 million units or plus, compared to MAU. Still about half of the people are playing on PS4, so console generation overlap will be handled well, and MAU will steadily increase. And this made Steven take it a step further, where he was fielding responses from people that are currently playing on Xbox One or PS4, and just, being curious as to why consumers nowadays might still be playing on those machines and they haven't upgraded to the new ones just yet. And so some of the initial answers he got, some of the more obvious ones would be games, money. The less obvious answers would be the pandemic shortages actually got people used to not having the latest console. And so that's kind of what he was getting into. And so I did see this shared around a number of places. A lot of people were talking about this. And so, I'll tell you, for me, when I initially saw this, I thought, well, where is the news here? You know what I mean? Like, no flack at Steven. I've always really appreciated his work and followed him over the years. But I initially saw this get reposted and a lot of people talking about it. And I'm like, well, what is the news? Because we're halfway through PlayStation 5. It's a slow transitionary period from PS4 players going over to PlayStation 5. So there's really nothing out of the ordinary here, especially when we consider that there's prior console cycles one could look at and examine, and there's maybe some different outlier scenarios that can be talked about there. Maybe a situation where one platform grew exponentially from the outgoing one, or one maybe didn't do all that well, and so people were jumping ship to a different platform, or maybe more modern consoles, and we can try and pinpoint some kind of pattern of people not even buying new consoles but leaving for either PC or mobile or tablets, or a new generation coming in. There's so many ways this could be examined if we're talking about older platforms or different console cycles, and certainly across different manufacturers. But in this case, this seems to be the most bog standard when we think about PlayStation being a very well-known, popular brand with a lot of loyalty, and you've got one successful outgoing platform and then a new one that's just as successful, to the point where launch aligned with PS4, it's so similar. So sure enough, halfway through PS5, about half are still on PS4. And again, that's from Sony themselves, because I know the initial sort of side point one might make here is that there is a way that those numbers, the MAU numbers, could be obfuscated, either by way of like multi-user households. As long as somebody's logging into PSN, then that is probably going to contribute to the MAU number. Or maybe less common would be a PlayStation 3 user. They do contribute to MAUs as well. We saw from the Insomniac breach that there's about 1 million PS3 users still actively using the console, which is awesome, although that number is already a little bit old, so I imagine it's probably less than 1 million. So clearly that's not moving the needle for this conversation. So the best way to consider this is that, yes, we're about halfway through, half are still on PS4. And for the MAU number, Sony actually was not reporting monthly active users up until like the start of, right before PlayStation 5 came out. So this would have been the fiscal year of 2020. So back in Q1, which the MAU number back then was only like 112, 114 million, something like that. And then it pretty much stays around that number up until where we are now, where their peak was 123 million. And then that dropped down from the outgoing quarter to now 118 million. But it does show that MAUs are not really growing, which they're not going to, of course, because we're in a the console business does not necessarily grow. It's always 150 to 250 million people that tend to buy consoles per cycle, and at least for the platform holders, it's always a matter of being able to capture the biggest amount of that pie, right? That finite pie that we have, since typically the console market is just not growing. With that in mind, though, as somebody that has spent a lot of time examining PlayStation 3 in its legacy years and how that console is still operational and working, and PSN services still work, you can still message people, there's private servers getting restored, the PlayStation Store still works on that console, which is miraculous. But it got me thinking, for PS4, which is not legacy at all right now, I mean, it's still highly active and relevant, and it's something where it got me thinking, though, that this console is probably going to have longer legs than even what PlayStation 3 is seeing right now, given where these two machines were within their time, right? What those consoles represented, but also more so the kind of software they were seeing. I mean, PS4 right now, there's still this ongoing conversation about the cross-gen period, because PS4 still gets a lot of games. It's a highly relevant console that has this good foundation for developers to ship games on it. Considering, one, we don't have that many publishers that can even ship multi-million-dollar projects that have to leave PlayStation 4, even though we're seeing a number of studios finally do that now. But developers big and small, there's still a lot of upside to shipping on as many SKUs as possible, and there's a lot of people still playing on PlayStation 4, and we're also talking about machines that are still principally x86 based hardware across so many platforms now. We're well outside the realm of esoteric console architectures, right? So it's not like this huge cost prohibitive thing to ship on PS3 and say PS4, you know what I mean? With that in mind, it's something where I really started wondering, for PS4, this console is probably going to see a lot of long-term support well beyond what PlayStation 3 saw. And that's when you look at the kind of games that we get nowadays, right? I mean, there's so many free-to-play titles, something like Fortnite, or Destiny. Of course, this really depends on, I think, how long those games are going to be supported on those particular platforms, and this more so really falls on Sony at the end of the day. Is this going to be something where they let PlayStation Network on PS4 start to rot away, and it becomes like a skeleton crew really operating the platform and making sure that it still has the lights on, kind of like PlayStation 3 in a way? As cool as it is that PS3 is still primarily functional, it can be very sluggish and kind of hard to navigate nowadays, and you kind of have to know what to look for, whether it's buying stuff on the store or trying to discover a new private server community, if you even know if the community exists, right? So with that in mind, though, I think PS4 is just going to be relevant for such a long time. I mean, we've even got a rumor right now about how Call of Duty is still going to ship on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 this year. Same for EA Sports FC, right? I mean, these are two pretty popular yearly franchises that we can look back at the prior gen, and they gave up on those platforms a lot quicker than, say, what Call of Duty is still doing right now for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. There's still a pretty big player base. And so regardless of the cross-gen period, I mean, because again, we're in diminishing returns anyway, right? For a lot of titles, it's not like PS4 and Xbox One are really holding certain games back, because again, there's just not enough publishers that can even put out a sort of Hellblade 2 or a Spider-Man 2, right? We're more limited on publishers and funding, more so than actual on-paper hardware performance. So, I'm not going to suggest that the MAU number is actually going to grow, but I just think PS4 is going to see this sort of legacy afterlife that, especially for the free-to-play titles. I mean, I feel like the only thing that's going to stop PlayStation 4 and even Xbox One is simply a matter of how long are those publishers going to support content updates for the free-to-play titles, and also Sony making sure the PSN backend is operational. Will they be willing to make sure the store is functional for as long as PlayStation 3, with making sure credit card support works for as long as they can do so before security problems become an issue and they drop all that support and they limit it to PSN wallet funding from store cards, basically gift cards. There's just, I don't know, that's what got me thinking. But the other angle of this that I'll mention to close us out is I am so curious as to what a title like Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to do. How far along is that going to move the needle here? Because that game will only ship on Series S, X, and PlayStation 5. A big game like that completely skipped PS4 and Xbox One. We did not get a mainline Grand Theft Auto, a new one on PS4 and X1. So this is kind of a big deal. So big to where it genuinely will be not quite a mass exodus of PS4 owners, but I feel like we actually might see console sales shift in a pretty big, meaningful way if they're looking to play the next Rockstar epic. But either way, that's kind of where we're at with MAUs. Half on PS4, I think people are still pretty okay with that, and they don't feel the pressure to upgrade until maybe something like a Grand Theft Auto 6 comes around. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.